What is known about Homer?
It is most likely that Homer was an oral poet and performer. Though little is known about Homer, it's believed that he was an Ionian Greek who lived circa the 8th or 9th century BC. In the 1920s, scholar Milman Parry proved that Homer's poems were formulaic in nature, relying on generic epithets, such as wine dark sea and rosy-fingered dawn. Repetition of stock lines and descriptions and themes typical of oral folk poetry. All of this suggested that Homer was most likely a bard or rhapsodian, itinerant professional reciter who improvised pieces to be sung at Greek festivals.
Who was the first person in space?
The first person in space was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, 1934 to 1968, who orbited the Earth in the spaceship Vostok 1, launched April 12. 1961. The flight lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes. The achievement made Gagarin an international hero. U.S. President John F. Kennedy. 1917 to 1963, announced later that year, on November 25, that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The first step toward reaching that goal was made by putting the first American into space. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard Jr., 1923 to 1998, piloted the first U.S. space flight. Aboard the Freedom 7, the suborbital flight reached an altitude of 116.5 miles. Just more than 9 months later, the United States put a man into orbit. On February 20, 1962, astronaut John Glenn Jr. 1921, orbited Earth 3 times in the spaceship Friendship 7.
What was the progressive movement?
It was a campaign for reform on every level: social, political, and economic in the United States. It began during the economic depression that was brought on by the Panic of 1873 and lasted until 1917, when Americans entered World War I, 1914-18. During the first 100 years of the U.S. Constitution, 1788, federal lawmakers and justices proved reluctant to get involved in or attempt to regulate private business. This policy of non-interference had allowed the gap to widen between rich and poor. The turn of the century was a time in America when early industrialists built fantastic mansions while many workers and farmers struggled to earn a living, when tenement houses sprang up in urban areas to meet, albeit horribly inadequately, the housing needs made present by a steady stream of immigrants. And when labor unions, which had only recently begun to organize, were beset by outbreaks of violence, hurting their fight for better treatment by employers. Observing these problems, progressive-minded reformers, comprised largely of middle-class Americans. Women, and journalists, the so-called muckrakers, began reform campaigns at the local and state levels, eventually affecting changes at the federal level. Progressives favored many of the ideas that had previously been espoused by the populists, including antitrust legislation to bust up the monopolies and a graduated income tax to more adequately collect public funds from the nation's well-to-do businessmen. Additionally, progressives combated corrupt local governments, dirty and dangerous working conditions in factories, mines, and fields, and inner-city blight. The minimum wage, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and Chicago's Hull House, which served as an incubator for the American social work movement, are part of the legacy of the progressive movement.
Why was Macedonian King Alexander known as the Great?
The Macedonian King Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 B.C., has passed through history as a legendary figure. A reputation attributable to the fact that he conquered virtually all of the known world in his day. In effect, he was king of the world, though his tenure in that role was relatively brief. Born in the Greek city-state of Macedonia, Alexander was the son of King Philip II. 382 to 336 BC, who had risen to power 3 years earlier. He had an upbringing and education befitting a young Greek prince. Alexander was tutored by Greek philosopher Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, and was trained in athletics and war. His studies of Greek literature and art would later combine with his skill as a warrior to produce a formidable conqueror. Inspired by Greek culture, he also possessed the military prowess and cunning necessary to spread Hellenism, Greek culture, throughout the known world. At the age of 16, Alexander began running the government of Macedonia while his father, King Philip, waged military campaigns to protect and expand his kingdom. At the age of 17, Alexander joined his father on the battlefield, where he commanded a section of the army to defeat Thebes. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander acted quickly to assert his claim to the throne. Having done so by 335 BC, he continued to carry out his father's campaigns, securing Greece and the Balkan Peninsula by the fall of that year. He followed this with an all-out offensive on the Persian Empire, long the enemy of Greece. Supremely courageous and confident in his own abilities as well as in his troops, which numbered in the tens of thousands. By the fall of 331 BC, Alexander had defeated the Persian army and along the way claimed Egypt. The centuries-old Persian Empire crumbled, and the young Macedonian king proclaimed himself Lord of Asia. Still, he pressed on, claiming Afghanistan, where he solidified his claim by marrying a young princess, and then India. He was poised to take the Arabian Peninsula in 324 BC when he died of fever. he was 33. His vast kingdom, which he had ruled leniently but nevertheless authoritatively, was divided among his former generals.
When was AIDS first diagnosed?
The first AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Cases were identified in 1981 by physicians in Los Angeles and New York City. Since that time, researchers traced possible cases of the disease back to 1969. The human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which severely damages the body's ability to fight disease, is transmitted through sexual contact, shared drug needles, and infected blood transfusions. While the disease was believed to have been transmitted somehow to humans from monkeys. Since research shows HIV to be similar to simian immunodeficiency viruses, HIV has never been isolated in any wild animal. While the source of the deadly disease has not been definitively determined, scientists believe that infection began in Africa during the 1960s and 1970s when significant numbers of people migrated from rural areas to cities. The overcrowding and unemployment that resulted contributed to the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. AIDS is now considered endemic to many developing nations, where it is spread mostly among heterosexual men and women. In developed nations, education programs have made the public aware of how the disease is transmitted, helping curb the spread of HIV. Drug treatments are still being developed to treat HIV/AIDS, no cure has been discovered. A 2004 report from the United Nations stated that there were 38 million people living with HIV in the world. Almost 70% of them in sub-Saharan Africa. The same report states that more than 20 million people had died since the first cases were identified in 1981.
How did CNN change television news?
When Ted Turner's cable news network, CNN, went on the air June 1, 1980, it was amid a fair amount of skepticism. Some thought the maverick businessman was ill-advised to air news around the clock to cable television subscribers. History would soon prove Turner's detractors wrong. 24 hours of airtime brought CNN something other news entities didn't have the time to do: more stories and more in-depth news stories. The American public embraced the concept and soon began to rely on CNN not only to provide more information than other TV news sources, but for breaking news and up-to-the-minute updates on top stories. In 1991, during the CNN coverage of the Persian Gulf War, which CNN had more or less aired live, newspapers reported a phenomenon: Americans couldn't turn the news station off. Gone were the days of planning dinner around the evening network news or waiting until 11 p.m. to learn the latest. CNN and its sister station, Headline News Network, were news at the ready. At a time when the term global marketplace was quickly becoming part of the vocabulary of every working American, CNN was uniquely able to capitalize on the growing sensibility of a world community. In 1985, CNN International was launched as a 24-hour global news service. At first reaching only to England, by 1989 the signal was beamed via satellite to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. CNN has continued to evolve its programming to cover news in every area of endeavor, with programs such as Business Day, Larry King Live, World Today, and Science and Technology Week, proving that the concept has staying power. The network, which began turning a profit after 5 years, has picked up multiple journalism awards, including the coveted Peabody Award. One of the early harbingers of CNN's success came in April 1982 when CNN won the right to be on equal footing with the major network news organizations in the White House press pool.
What was the Cuban Missile Crisis?
The 1962 events, which happened very quickly, nevertheless constituted a major confrontation of the Cold War, 1947–89. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, when the United States backed Cuban expatriates in an attempt to oust Fidel Castro. 1926, the Soviet Union quietly began building missile sites in Cuba. Since the island nation is situated just south of Florida, when U.S. reconnaissance flights detected the Soviet military construction projects there, it was an alarming discovery. On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963, demanded that the Soviet Union withdraw its missiles from Cuba. Kennedy also ordered a naval blockade of the island. 6 days later, the Soviets agreed to dismantle the sites, ending the crisis.
Why is Johannes Kepler important to modern astronomy?
German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, put forth the theory that planets, including Earth, rotate around the Sun in elliptical orbits. But he had the help of research conducted by astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, to use as a basis for his conclusion. In 1600 Kepler moved to Prague, Czech Republic, where he began working as an assistant to the flamboyant Brahe, a Danish aristocrat who a few years earlier, in 1576, had set up the first real astronomical observatory in history. Brahe's benefactor in this work was none other than King Frederick II. 1534–1588, ruler of Denmark and Norway, who was a patron of science. In the observatory, Brahe had made and recorded extraordinarily accurate observations of planetary positions. Even though he rejected the Copernican, sun-centered, view of the universe because it violated church beliefs, He also realized that his observations of the planets could not be explained by the Ptolemaic system. He soon put forth his own theory of planetary orbit. The tectonic theory was something of a compromise between the two existing models. The Sun-centered system of Copernicus and Earth-centered system of Ptolemy Brahe's model followed Copernicus's theory in that it 2. Had the planets orbiting around the Sun, but it kept to the Ptolemaic belief that the Sun orbited Earth. In this way, he accounted for a year. The theory was ignored. But when Brahe hired Kepler in 1600, he turned over his observations to him and charged him with the task of devising a theory of planetary motion. As a mathematician, Kepler was the right man for the job. And he devoted himself to the effort for the next 20 years. At one point, Kepler had devised a scheme that almost matched Brahe's observations, but not quite. Believing Brahe's observations were perfectly accurate, Kepler threw out the scheme and started again. Finally, he gave up on using circular orbits and epicicles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones, and began working with ellipses, ovals. When Kepler charted the planets' orbits as ellipses, the results matched Brahe's data. In 1609 Kepler published his first two laws of planetary motion, in the work Astronomia Nova. A planet orbits the Sun in an ellipse, not a circle, as Copernicus had believed. And a planet moves faster when near the Sun and slower when farther away. We also have Kepler to thank for a word that is in everyday use, satellite. After Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, Kepler used a telescope to view them for himself. He dubbed them satellites. Satellis is from the Latin meaning attendant, a name that stuck. The celebrated astronomer also did pioneer work leading to the invention of calculus, late 1600s.
When was the first kindergarten?
The world's first kindergarten opened in 1837 in Blankenburg, Germany. Under the direction of educator Friedrich Froebel, 1782 to 1852. Froebel went on to establish a training course for kindergarten teachers. And he introduced the schools throughout Germany. Such schools and classes for children ages 4 to 6 are the norm today in much of the world.
How did Betty Friedan's feminine mystique launch the modern women's rights movement?
American author and activist Betty Friedan's, 1921, landmark work was published in 1963. She argued that in the post-war era American society expected women only to be devoted housewives and mothers. This was the ideal, the mystique, that was both promoted and accepted. In the feminine mystique Friedan challenged this prevailing notion, causing many women to re-examine their lives. After all, during World War II, 1939-45, women had ably stepped into the workplace to keep industry running as the men went to war. When the servicemen came back, women returned to the home and were not expected to seek careers.
Are the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution the same?
The two terms describe interrelated and sequential European intellectual movements that took place from the 1500s to the 1800s. Together, the movements shaped an era that would lay the foundations of modern Western civilization. Foundations that required the use of reason, or rational thought, to understand the universe, nature, and human relations. During this period, many of the greatest minds in Europe developed new scientific, mathematical, philosophical, and social theories. Scientists came to believe that observation and experimentation would allow them to discover the laws of nature. Thus, the scientific method emerged, which required tools. Soon the microscope, thermometer, sextant, slide rule, and other instruments were invented. Scientists working during this time included Sir Isaac Newton (1642 to 1727), Joseph Priestley (1733 to 1804), and René Descartes (1596 to 1650). The era witnessed key discoveries and saw rapid advances in astronomy, anatomy, mathematics, and physics. The advances had an impact on education. Universities introduced science courses to the curricula, and elementary and secondary schools followed suit. As people became trained in science, new technologies emerged, complicated farm machinery and new equipment for textile manufacturing and transportation was developed, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution.
Who was Eleanor of Aquitaine?
Eleanor of Aquitaine, c. 1122 to 1204, was among the most powerful figures of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. Her father was William X, 1099 to 1137, the Duke of Aquitaine, one of the largest and wealthiest regions that became modern France. It extended from the Loire River to the Pyrenees Mountains. Eleanor inherited her father's vast holdings when he died in 1137, she was a teenager at the time. The same year, she married Louis VII, c. 1120 to 1180, who, within a month, succeeded his father as the King of France. As queen, Eleanor took an active role in her husband's business, even accompanying him on the Second Crusade. 1147 to 49, purportedly so that she and her numerous female attendants could care for the wounded. The expedition ended in failure, largely because of a disagreement between the king and queen about the objective. Thereafter, women were prohibited from joining the Crusades. Though Eleanor and Louis had 2 children, both daughters, they were granted an annulment of their unhappy marriage in 1152 on the grounds that they were distantly related. According to feudal law, Eleanor regained Aquitaine. Within a year she married again, to Henry Plantagenet. 1133 to 1189, of England, who was some 10 years her junior. In 1154 he became King Henry II, and Eleanor was again queen, this time of England. Though the couple had 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, their marriage was stormy. Henry had liaisons with other women, the result of which was an illegitimate line of heirs to the throne. Eleanor also resented him for his attempts to control Aquitaine, which she felt was rightly hers. In 1173, when Henry and Eleanor's 3 surviving sons attempted to depose their father, Eleanor threw her support behind her sons. The rebellion failed, and Eleanor fled for France. In 1174 she was captured and returned to England, where she was put in semi-confinement by her husband. The king, until his death in 1189. Henry died while attempting to put down another rebellion by his sons. Richard the Lion-Hearted 1157 to 1199 and John Lackland 1167 to 1216. After King Henry's death, Eleanor again became a powerful force in European politics. Her son, Richard the Lion-Hearted, inherited the English throne, and she took an active role in his administration. She even stepped in for him when he left England to fight in the Crusades. When Richard died in 1199, his brother John ascended the throne. Eleanor, then in her late 70s, continued to wield power and influence. In an effort to ensure the future of the Plantagenets and to reconcile the English and French aristocracies, she arranged for one of her granddaughters to marry the son of the French king. She also managed to secure the family's land holdings in France for King John. She retired from her active political life in 1202 and died 2 years later.
What was the first book?
It was the Diamond Sutra, published in the year A.D. 868. Archaeologists discovered it in the caves of the Thousand Buddhas, at Kansu, Gansu, China.
When was the Office of Homeland Security formed?
The Office of Homeland Security was organized in the days following the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks. President George W. Bush, 1946, chose Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge, 1945, as the first Office of Homeland Security advisor. Ridge was sworn in on October 8, 2001. The office was elevated to the department level on November 25, 2002, when President Bush signed into law the Homeland Security Act, creating the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and making Ridge a cabinet-level administrator. The DHS consolidated several existing agencies and pledged to carry out new initiatives to the extent possible, protect the nation from further attacks. Agencies and sub-departments within the DHS's purview eventually included the Transportation Security Administration, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection Offices, U.S. Citizenship and Information Services, formerly the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, an Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Secret Service. On February 15, 2005, Ridge was succeeded by Michael Chertoff, 1953. A former U.S. Circuit Court judge. Chertoff had also worked as an assistant attorney general, in that position. He helped trace the 9/11 terrorist attacks to the Al-Qaeda network and worked to increase information sharing within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and with state and local officials.
How is the current era characterized?
Ask the question of most any observer, and the answer would include catchphrases like global marketplace, global village, or globalization. Modern communications and transportation connect people as never before. Businesses enjoy broader markets for their goods and services. Manufacturing facilities and jobs are located far from the offices of the companies that market them, and people of many nationalities, races, and religions have more and more contact with one another every day, for business and pleasure. Some observers worry that this contact will blur rich cultural differences, diluting diversity. Others say that globalization will bring tolerance and increase understanding. Whatever the case, we are living our lives on a global stage. The things we buy and use are as likely to carry "Made in China" or "Made in Mexico" labels as they are any other. People continents away talk to each other not just over the telephone, but via cell phones. Instant messages, email, and internet chat rooms. We have an international forum, the Internet, for buying, selling, and publishing, and we can get almost anywhere in the world with all due haste. Everything travels faster today, including ideas. The upsides are many. Modern communications and transportation made it possible, for example, for the world to mobilize aid to victims of the Southeast Asian tsunami of December 2004. But there are downsides as well. Critics say globalization is fueling the exploitation of workers in developing nations, contributing to a modern slave trade, rapidly depleting resources, and wiping out environmental diversity. These are some of the reasons protesters have demonstrated outside meetings of the World Trade Organization. Why some people opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and oppose the pending CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement. And why many people dislike that American popular culture is marketed around the world. The problem could be distilled to this: diversity versus homogeneity. and the resulting culture clashes are not restricted to the realm of scholarly thought. They are making headline news. The enemy is no longer the strong-armed, nuclear-fortified, absolutist government of the Cold War era. Though, as of mid-2005, North Korea remained a serious concern, the enemy. As the U.S. State Department reminds us, is any group of individuals with extreme views.
What are the characteristics of medieval times?
Although the Middle Ages were shadowed by poverty, ignorance, economic chaos, bad government, and the plague, it was also a period of cultural and artistic achievement. For example, the university originated in medieval Europe. The first university was established in 1158 in Bologna, Italy. The period was marked by the belief, based on the Christian faith, that the universe is an ordered world, ruled by an infinite and all-knowing God. This belief persisted even through the turmoil of wars and social upheavals. And it is evident in the soaring Gothic architecture, such as the Cathedral of Chartres. France, the poetry of Dante Alighieri, 1265-1321, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225-1274, the Gregorian chant, and the music of such composers as Guillaume de Machaut, c. 1300-1377.
When did the anti-slavery movement begin?
In the United States, the campaign to prohibit slavery strengthened in the early 1800s. Across the Atlantic, abolitionists had successfully lobbied for the outlaw of slave trade in Great Britain by 1807. The following year, the U.S. government also outlawed the trade, but possession of slaves remained legal and profitable. In the 1830s, the call to abolish slavery and emancipate slaves became an active movement in the United States, precipitated by a revival of evangelical religion in the North. Abolitionists, believing slavery is morally wrong and violates Christian beliefs, called for an end to the system, which had become critical to the agrarian economy of the southern states, where plantations produced cotton, tobacco, and other crops for domestic and international markets.
What is Jonas Salk known for?
American physician Jonas Edward Salk, 1914-1995, is familiar to many as the inventor of the polio vaccine. In 1952, more than 21,000 cases of paralytic polio, the most severe form of polio, were reported in the United States. An acute viral infection, poliomyelitis, also called polio or infantile paralysis, invades the central nervous system. It is found worldwide and mainly in children. In 1953, After years of research that included sorting through all the studies done on immunology since the mid-1800s, Salk announced the formulation of a vaccine, which contained all three types of polio known at the time. Salk tested it on himself first, and then on his wife and 3 children. Experiencing no side effects and finding the vaccine to be effective. It was then tested on 1.8 million school children, in a program sponsored by the March of Dimes, then called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. In April 1955 the vaccine was pronounced safe and effective. Salk was duly honored, including with a Congressional Gold Medal and a citation from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1890 to 1969, 4 years later, American physician Albert B. Sabin, 1906 to 1993, developed an effective polio vaccine that could be taken orally versus via injection. It is the sugar cube so well known to people around the world. That vaccine contains live viruses. Salk's was a killed virus vaccine. The 2 vaccines virtually eradicated polio from developed nations.
Who invented the first personal computer?
Development of the personal computer, PC, a microcomputer designed to be used by one person, was first developed for business use in the early 1970s. Digital Equipment Corporation developed the PDP-8, which was predominantly used in scientific laboratories. The credit for development of a computer for home use goes to Steve Wozniak, 1950. And Steve Jobs, 1955, college dropouts who founded Apple Computer in 1976. They spent 6 months working out of a garage, developing the crude prototype for Apple I, which was bought by some 600 hobbyists who had to know how to wire, program, and set up the machine. Its successor, Apple II, was introduced in 1977 as the first fully assembled programmable microcomputer, but it still required customers to use their televisions as screens and to use audio cassettes for data storage. It retailed for just less than $1. 300 That same year Commodore and Tandy introduced affordable personal computers. In 1984 Apple Computer introduced the Macintosh, Mac, which became the first widely used computer with a graphical user interface, GUI. By this time, International Business Machines, IBM, had introduced its PC, 1981, which quickly overtook the Mac. In spite of the fact that IBM was behind in developing a user-friendly graphical interface.
Why is the Kennedy presidency called Camelot?
The term was actually assigned by Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929 to 1994. Shortly after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November 22, 1963. The former First Lady was talking with a journalist when she described her husband's presidency as an American Camelot. And she asked that his memory be preserved. Camelot refers, of course, to the time of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and has come to refer to a place or time of idyllic happiness. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's widow, who had with fortitude and grace guided her family and the country through the sorrow and anguish of the president's funeral, quite naturally held sway over the American public. So when she suggested that the shining moments of her husband's presidency were reminiscent of the legends of Camelot, journalists picked up on it. Despite subsequent revelations that there were difficulties in the Kennedy marriage, public opinion polls indicate that the image of Camelot, albeit somewhat tarnished, has prevailed.
Since the beauty of the manuscript, what was the first American newspaper?
America's first regular newspaper was the Weekly Newsletter, published by Boston postmaster John Campbell, 1653 to 1728. It was published for nearly 2 decades, between 1704 and 1722, and consisted of a single 7 by 11-inch sheet of paper covered on both sides with news. Not all of it substantiated, from post riders, sea captains, and sailors. By 1765 there were more than 20 newspapers in the American colonies. Was meant to represent the spiritual beauty of the text, usually Gospels, Psalms, prayers, or meditations. Sacred books became increasingly ornamental. Some books of hours, devotional books developed during the 1300s, are considered masterpieces of illumination. The works, c. 1409-16, of Belgian illuminators Paul Herman and Johanniken Limburg represent the height of painted religious manuscripts.
What was the Night of Terror?
It is a little-known episode in the American suffragist movement that took place on November 14, 1917, at the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. After President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, took office in January 1917, activists began picketing daily outside the White House, demanding the right to vote for women. It was the first time in history that demonstrators had marched at the White House. The suffragists carried banners that read, "Mr.
What were vassals?
In the Middle Ages, 500-1350, a vassal was anyone who was under the protection of another and therefore owed and avowed not only allegiance but a payment of some sort to their protector. Peasants, serfs and village commoners were always vassals to a lord, whether it was the lord of the manor or the lord of the fief. but the lord of the manor was himself a vassal to the lord of the fief. As kingdoms were created, with many fiefs within their jurisdiction, the feudal lords became the vassals of the kings.
What was Thomas Cavendish's claim to fame?
English navigator Thomas Cavendish, c. 1560 to 1592, followed in Sir Francis Drake's 1540 or 1543 to 1596 footsteps. Seeing Drake return from his exploits at sea and against the Spanish, Cavendish was inspired. And it was for good reason. Drake had earned himself fame, wealth, and the honor of being knighted. So in 1586 Cavendish set out with 3 ships for Brazil, made it through the Strait of Magellan, and then proceeded to capture Spanish treasure including their prized ship, the Santa Ana. The kings of Spain later mourned the loss and the fact that the ship had been taken by an English youth, with 40 or 50 companions. Cavendish, now in the Pacific, continued his voyage, which took him to the Philippines, Moluccas, and Java before he rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Africa, and returned home. The journey had taken 2 years and 50 days, cost him 2 of his own ships, and made him the 3rd person to circumnavigate the globe. But his welcome in England was not what he expected. Cavendish was received with acclaim, but was not knighted by the Queen. The fame and fortune that had come his way quickly vanished. He spent most of his new money, and his renown soon faded. By 1590 Cavendish thought he would try the journey again. Setting sail with 5 ships in August 1591, the fleet was headed for trouble. Having made it to South America, heavy storms separated the ships as they attempted to make their way through the Strait of Magellan. The ship Cavendish captain turned back toward Brazil, attempting to make landfall. But Cavendish himself never made it. He died en route, believing he had been deserted by his mates.
Why was the introduction of canning important?
The advent of canned foods not only created an industry, but it altered the average American diet, helped usher in the consumer age, and saved time. Canning, a process for preserving food, vegetables, fruits, meats, and fish, by heating and sealing it in airtight containers, was developed by French candy maker Nicolas-François Appert, c. 1750 to 1841, in 1809, though he did not understand why the process worked. Some 50 years later, the pioneering work of French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, explained that heating is necessary to the canning process since it kills bacteria, microorganisms, that would otherwise spoil the food. Canning was introduced to American consumers in stages. In 1821 the William Underwood Company began a canning operation in Boston, Massachusetts. In the 1840s oyster canning began in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1853 American inventor Gale Borden. 1801 to 1874, developed a way to condense and preserve milk in a can, founding the Borden Company 4 years later. And in 1858 American inventor John Landis Mason, 1832 to 1902, developed a glass jar and lid suited to home canning. Though early commercial canning methods did not ensure a safe product and many American women avoided the convenience foods, the canning industry grew rapidly. At least in part due to the male market, which included cowboys in the West. Between 1860 and 1870 the U.S. canning industry increased output from 5 million to 30 million cans. Improvements in the process during the 1870s helped eliminate the chance that cans would burst. A problem early on. And though the canning process changes food flavor, color, and texture, the convenience and long shelf life of canned foods helped them catch on. By the end of the 1800s a wide variety of canned foods, which had also come down in price, were common to the urban American diet. Companies such as Franco-American advertised in women's magazines, promoting their delicacies in tins. An outbreak of botulism in the 1920s prompted the American canning industry to make further improvements to its process.
Why is Titian thought of as the father of modern painting?
During Titian's time, 1488 or 1490 to 1576, artists began painting on canvas rather than on wood panels. A master of color, the Venetian painter was both popular and prolific. His work was so sought after that even with the help of numerous assistants, he could not keep up with demand. His body of works established oil color on canvas as the typical medium of Western pictorial tradition. Among his most well-known paintings are Sacred and Profane Love, c. 1515, and Venus of Urbino, 1538.
What were bonanza farms?
Bonanza farms were extremely successful and large farms, principally on the Great Plains and in the West, that emerged during the second half of the 1800s. The word bonanza, which is derived from Spanish and means literally good weather, was coined in the mid-1800s. It is used to refer to any source of great and sudden wealth including mines rich in minerals. Large-scale farming had been aided by the development of machinery that greatly increased production, especially of wheat and other grains. The innovations included reapers invented by Cyrus Hall McCormick, 1809 to 1884, and steel plows developed by John Deere, 1804 to 1886. Several events further helped farming interests west of the Mississippi River To promote westward settlement, Congress passed the Homestead Act, 1862, which allowed for ready and cheap acquisition of vast tracts of land. Settlers could buy land for as little as $1.25 per acre, or they could live on a tract and farm it for a period of 5 years, at the end of which they were granted 160 acres. The U.S. Army's defeats of rebel Indians were followed by peace treaties that confined Indian agricultural activities to reservations. In 1872, the Northern Pacific Railroad arrived at Fargo, North Dakota, allowing farmers to ship their products greater distances. Finally, dry farming techniques, which allow fields to lie fallow every other year in order to regain their nutrients and moisture to support crops the following year, proved to be a successful method for growing in the Great Plains, previously thought to be too dry for cultivating crops. All of these factors combined to turn some western farms into bonanza sources of great wealth for their owners. Encouraged by their success, settlers poured into the West. But not all farmers fared as well, and many were severely hit by the Panic of 1873, a drought in the plains. States in the 1880s caused farm prices to drop, further hurting Western farmers.
Would scientists soon be able to clone humans?
While technological advances continue to be made, government leaders around the world grapple with how to regulate the use of new life-giving technologies such as IVF.
What was the Comstock lode?
The richest silver mine in the United States, the Comstock lode was also plentiful in gold. The ore deposit was found in 1857 at Mount Davidson in western Nevada, about 16 miles southeast of Reno. The discoverers, Ethan Allen Grosh and Hosea Ballou Grosh, died before they could record the claim. American prospector Henry T. P. Comstock, 1820 to 1870, laid claim to the lode in 1859, but later sold it for an insignificant amount compared to what it was worth. The mine flourished until 1865 and again between 1873 and 1882, when the Big Bonanza, a super-rich ore vein, yielded more than $100 million. By 1882 the mine had yielded $397 million in ore and had produced half the United States silver output during the period. Western Nevada had become a hotbed of mining activity, attracting numerous prospectors. Among those who made their fortune from the Comstock lode was American mining magnate and future Senator George Hearst, 1820 to 1891. He used his fortune to buy the San Francisco Examiner in 1880, which was taken over by his son. American newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, 1863 to 1951, 7 years later. Virginia City, established in 1859 at the site of the discovery. became one of the West's boomtowns during the late 1800s. By 1898 the mines at the Comstock Lode were all but abandoned. Wasteful mining methods and the demonetization of silver brought its demise.
How were Southern blacks prevented from voting?
Besides intimidation, there were three different methods used in Southern states in the early part of the century to disenfranchise black citizens: 1. The poll tax, 2. Literacy tests, and 3. Grandfather clauses. The poll tax required a voter to pay a fee in order to exercise the right to vote. Literacy tests were implemented as a prerequisite for voting. This method also kept many poorly educated whites, unable to pass the exam, from casting their ballots as well. Most Southern states also adopted legislation by which voting rights were extended only to those citizens who had been able to vote as of a certain date, a date when few if any black men would have been able to vote. Since these laws made provisions for said voters' descendants as well, they were dubbed grandfather clauses. Such attempts to deny citizens the right to vote were made unlawful in 1964, by the 24th Amendment, which outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. In 1965, by the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed measures used to suppress minority votes. And in 1966, when poll taxes at the state and local levels were also declared illegal. Literacy tests and grandfather clauses were also struck down as unconstitutional.
How old is biological warfare?
Biological or germ warfare has a long history. For example, in the year 1343, Tatars, originally a nomadic tribe of East Central Asia, became sick with the bubonic plague. The disease, which is carried by fleas and rats, was called the Black Death because nearly all who became afflicted died. Invading the Crimea, in present-day Ukraine, the marauding Tatars encountered a group of Genos, Italian, merchants at a trading post. Besieging them, the Tatars catapulted their dead at their enemy, many of whom became infected, carrying the plague to Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, and to the Western European ports where they traveled. In the 20th century, the use of microorganisms or toxins that produce sickness in people or in animals, or that cause destruction to crops, was outlawed by the Geneva Gas Protocol of 1925. In 1972 the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was simultaneously opened for signature in Moscow, Washington, and London, and the agreement entered into force on March 26, 1975. Signed by more than 162 nations. The convention bans the development, production, stockpiling, acquisition, and retention of microbial or other biological agents or toxins. in types and in quantities that have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. Nevertheless, several nations have conducted further research into defense against biological warfare, including developing microorganisms suitable for military retaliation. The existence of such biological weapons including anthrax and smallpox remains a concern today. The possibility that Iraq possessed biological and chemical weapons of mass destruction was the primary reason for the U.S.-led invasion of that country in 2003.
What are the hallmarks of classical Greek civilization?
Among the great Greek philosophers are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Greek literature includes the epic poetry of Homer as well as the passionate love poems of Sappho. The Greeks gave humankind the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, which continue to be studied by students today, along with the comedies of Aristophanes and Menander. The classical Greeks loved to speak, and oratory is considered by some to be their highest form of prose. Orators known to the modern world are Antiphon, Lysias, Isocrates, and Demosthenes. Herodotus, called the father of history, left the modern world with an account of the Persian Wars. 500 to 449 BC, a conflict between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. The Greeks also gave humankind the father of medicine in physician Hippocrates, who taught that doctors should use reason to determine the cause of illness and should study the patient's appearance, behavior, and lifestyle to diagnose and treat. The Hippocratic Oath, versions of which are still sworn by medical students graduating today, is attributed to Hippocrates. Greek scientists include Thales and Pythagoras, scientist philosophers include Leucippus and Democritus. And of course, the Greeks gave modern culture the Olympic Games.
Have the Olympic Games been held regularly since 1896?
No. In spite of the fact that international harmony, truce of God, is one of the hallmarks of the modern Olympic movement, the Games have been cancelled by the governing body, the International Olympic Committee. IOC, due to world events. In 1916 the Games were cancelled because of World War I. 1914–18, the 1940 and 1944 Games were called off due to World War II, 1939–45. The Games have been affected by international politics, occasional boycotts, and demonstrations as well. Though the 1980 Summer Games continued as planned, the United States and as many as 62 other non-communist countries, including Japan and the Federal Republic of Germany, boycotted them in protest of the 1979 Soviet invasion of neighboring Afghanistan. The following Summer Games, held in Los Angeles in 1984, were boycotted by the Soviets. The official reason was cited as fear. though some skeptics believed the reason to be more specific, a fear of drug testing. In 1968, in Mexico City, two African American track medalists rose gloved and clenched fists of support for Black Power, which earned them suspension and expulsion from the Olympic Village. Olympic history turned dark when the 1972 Summer Games in Munich. 11 Israeli athletes were killed in the Olympic Village by the Arab terrorist group Black September. A 1996 bombing at Olympic Park in Atlanta, Georgia also cast a shadow over the Games.
What is natural law?
Natural law is the theory that some laws are fundamental to human nature, and as such they can only be known through human reason without reference to man-made law. Roman orator and philosopher Cicero, 106–43 BC, insisted that natural law is universal, meaning it is binding to governments and people everywhere.
What is Plato's theory of forms?
The theory, or doctrine, of forms, also called the theory of ideas, is Greek philosopher Plato's, c. 428–347 BC, expression of his belief that there are forms that exist outside the material realm, and therefore are unchanging. They do not come into existence, change, or pass out of existence. It is these ideas that, according to Plato, are the objects or essence of knowledge. Further, he posited that the body, the seat of appetite and passion, which communes with the physical world, rather than the world of ideas or forms, is inferior to the intellect. He believed the physical aspect of human beings to be irrational, while the intellect, or reason, was deemed to be rational. The origins of Plato's theory can be traced to Socrates, c. 470–399 BC, who believed that the psyche, inner spirit, has intuitive access to divinely known principles or truths, which he attempted to formulate through his conversations with others. Indeed, the Socratic dialogues, written by Plato, reveal that Socrates was striving to define the exact nature of the traditional Greek moral virtues of piety, temperance, and courage.
What were knights?
In the Middle Ages, 500–1350, knights were armed and mounted warriors who were also landholders. In other words, they were noblemen who took up arms. A knight might have been the lord of a manor who vowed to fight for the feudal lord, the lord of the fief where the manor was situated. During the Carolingian age, during the 8th and 9th centuries, when a monarchy was established in Western Europe, a feudal lord might also have been a knight in service to the king. In times of war, any man who pledged loyalty to his lord and took up arms on his behalf would become a knight. who later might receive lands from the lord or king as repayment. During the Crusades, 1096 to 1291, knights were made of men who were not landowners. They were instead designated by primogeniture. The eldest son would bear the honor of becoming a knight. Knighthood was traditionally conferred by a blow on the shoulder with the flat side of a sword. Feudal knighthood ended by the 16th century. Today, the only vestige of this tradition is found in Britain, where knighthood is an honorific designation conferred by the king or queen on a noble or commoner for extraordinary achievement.
Are apostles and disciples the same thing?
No. The apostles were the 12 followers chosen by Jesus, c. 6b.cc AD 30. As described in the New Testament of the Bible. The term apostle is also used to identify other early missionaries, such as Barnabas and Paul. Saul, who in Acts 13:2-3 are singled out by the Holy Spirit to be missionaries. A disciple is any follower of Jesus. Therefore, all the apostles were disciples. But not all disciples were apostles.
When did the big band era begin?
On December 1, 1934, Benny Goodman's Let's Dance was broadcast on network radio, which effectively launched the swing era, in which big band music achieved huge popularity. Goodman, 1909 to 1986, was a virtuoso clarinetist and bandleader. His jazz-influenced dance band took the lead in making swing the most popular style of the time.
When was paper money first used?
Paper money first appeared in China during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. In the 9th century AD, paper notes were used by Chinese merchants as certificates of exchange and later, for paying taxes to the government. It was not until the 11th century, also in China, that the notes were backed by deposits of silver and gold, called hard money.
How are religions classified?
Religion, which is a system of beliefs that usually centers on whatever is beyond the known or the natural, is commonly divided between elementary forms and higher religions. Some elementary forms, or traditional religions, are animism, the belief in spirits in nature or in natural objects, ancestor worship, revering the spirits of the dead, and totemism, belief in a mystical relationship between a group of people and an emblem. Animists might believe in spirits living in the sea or in the mountains. Believers in ancestor worship will both honor and fear the spirits of dead family members for if they are neglected by the living. These spirits are believed to be able to bring harm to their descendants. Within clans, some tribal peoples adopt totems, such as a lion or a turtle. Totemists will be careful throughout their lives not to harm the animal or object that serves as their clan's emblem. Higher religions are those that embody a concept of transcendence. Higher religions are classified as polytheistic, believing in many gods, dualistic, believing in equally powerful gods of good and evil, monotheistic, believing in one God, and pantheistic, believing in God as the forces and laws of the universe, or the worship of all gods. Religions are further classified as revealed or non-revealed. Revealed religions are those that followers know through divine agency. Both Christianity and Islam are revealed religions. Non-revealed religions, such as Buddhism, Brahmanism, or Taoism, are known only through inquiry.